gap that will be widening and widening in the years to come. The Soviet Union's leadership is well aware of the fact that it simply cannot match the West's superiority on these fields. In short, SDI is a game the Soviets must play, but it is a game that the Soviets cannot win. No one knows this better than the Soviets themselves. They have attempted, with all the disinformation, with all the propaganda with which we have been so familiar over the past 40 years, to stop, to defamate SDI. They have had, as they have always had in the past, those people in the West either blinded by their own ignorance or those people who can usually be counted on to do Moscow's bidding for it, to try to condemn SDI. They have singularly failed in this mission simply because President Reagan indeed talked about SDI with Mr. Gorbachev, but he refused adequately to negotiate SDI with Mr. Gorbachev. Ladies and gentlemen, no longer shackled, if you will, by the spectrum of our being only a military equal to the Soviet Union. We will be doing this during a time when the West will continue to become stronger and stronger vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. Indeed, I think the description of the Soviet Union by the Soviet criminologist now living in Washington, D.C., Dmitry Simes, wherein he described the Soviet Union as a kind of well-armed Austria-Hungary, decadent but dangerous. I think the decadence will continue. I think we can count on Mr. Gorbachev attempting his reforms, quote unquote, but as we all know, reforms in the Soviet Union have been carried on ever since 1917 with results which are well known. Quite frankly, the ruling nomenclature class in the Soviet Union is not going to reform itself out of its position and its privileges. Any attempt to do so would be suicidal on the part of any Soviet leader. Thus, we will be dealing with the Soviet Union, which will adamantly refuse to reform itself simply because it cannot do so. And we will be dealing with the Soviet Union that will find itself increasingly falling behind the West in all important areas of science and technology. And it is incumbent upon us as citizens at this conference, and when we return to our countries, incumbent upon us as citizens of our countries to exercise as much influence as we can on the respective foreign policy establishment of our countries, to move away from the defensive posture that we have embraced over the past 40 years and move toward a policy that is commensurate with our emerging superiority over the Soviet Union. If history teaches us anything, history teaches us that there are no inevitabilities. History teaches us that we can translate our moral values, those values which we not only embrace, but which we should embody by our own conduct, that we can translate these into action. And it is my sincere hope, encouraged, I must say, a great deal by some of the outstanding remarks made yesterday by the youth panel, which gives us hope that perhaps with those young men and women in 10 to 20 years who move into positions of responsibility, that they too will be able to carry on our struggle throughout the world for the attainment of the goals and values that we all cherish. Thank you very much.
Resides in Israel. He's the author of many articles and commentaries on concentration camps and Soviet Russian oppression, nations, and peoples. is the author of Moskovitchina, an analysis of contemporary Soviet Russia and its communist system, published in Ukrainian and Russian language. Mr. Budka has traveled through England, America, and Canada on lecture tours, promoting the rights of the segregated nations, and he has participated in international conference of the World Anti-Communist League. Mr. Budka, please.
Шановний голова, шановні слухачі, я не хочу мучити вас подвійною промовою, та передам слово нашій перекладачці, яка чудово володіє обома мовами. Крім того, вчора я переконався, що вона вміє промовляти теж не гірше за мене. Значить, вона виглядає краще за мене, то ви самі бачите.
Дякую за такі суперлятивні. Mr. Budka apologizes to all of you. He said he will not bore you with his abominable English language. And as I translated his speech into English, I'm going to read it to you. Thank you. Mr. Budka's address is called Weaknesses of the Soviet-Russian Empire. The Soviet system is a refined and accomplished tyranny where there is no room for anything human. All human imperfections and feelings serve as fodder for the expansion of the empire. Anything which is advantageous to the empire is thoroughly exploited. Anything which stands in its way is completely destroyed whenever possible, or incessantly weakened and divided internally and externally. When a head-on assault is denied, chances of success. One way or another, a person who wants to be an integral part of the system must recreate himself into a proficient slave in all aspects of his spiritual and physical being, thereby contradicting all the fundamental qualities of a human being, destroying his foundation. This is why the Soviet system will never arrest debilitating alcoholism, the real opium of the people, through which people wrench themselves away from their anti-human realities with which they cannot become reconciled. It was not for blue jeans that a person of such prominence as Arkady Shevchenko defected to the free world, but for the breath of freedom, the thirst for which is not destroyed even in the darkest of souls. All human needs, but for the basest animal ones, contradict the Soviet system. In this contradiction lies the system's fatal flaw, which ruins its material foundation, because today even a household is not based on servile physical labor, but on the discoveries of human thought and initiative. Irresponsible, slave-like waiting for orders from above lead to the reality that the main suppliers of contemporary technology for the Russian Empire is not an army of Soviet intellectuals, but a cloud of spies. The Soviet radio shrieks day and night about the great successes of farmers on endless collective fields, but the USSR annually increases its grain imports from capitalist America. Almost all of the countries of Eastern Europe subjugated by Moscow have attempted sweeping economic and social reforms, all of which have been either stifled, tamed, or curtailed by Moscow. Red China, which considered itself the bastion of Asian communist fanaticism, having torn away from Moscow, today is introducing some reforms. And here a question arises. Why, even in a communist world, is Moscow the exception? Why does Moscow choose to commit itself to unavoidable lagging rather than allow the smallest breath of freedom? The answer was provided by one of Russia's tsars. I quote, "Constitution, it's a wonderful thing, but it will be taken advantage of by separatists." End quote. In this lies the fundamental differentiation of Russian mentality, for whom it is important to keep other nations under its boot and systematically conquer what is until now the free world. Without this axiom, one can't understand the secretive nature of Muscovy and the actual national roots of communism, its unscrupulous cruelty and aggression. Be proud. The root of Moscow's weakness lies in the subjugated nations, because it is enough for the central power to totter and all the subjugated nations will rise against it as they did in 1918, when all the enslaved nations rid themselves of Russian occupation, if only temporarily. The captive nations are preparing the same surprise for Moscow in the future, this time without former rosy illusions which were washed away forever by the blood of the victims of Russian genocide. It is not by accident that 90% of political prisoners in the USSR are nationalists, and foremost Ukrainians. Namely, it is the dread of the liberation nationalism of the subjugated nations which pushes Russia onto a path of discord between the subjugated nations themselves and the threatened nations. This is the old Roman motto of divide and conquer. Past historical conflicts between nations are dispersed in order not to see the current fatal danger. I want to personally bring your attention to the brutal persecution long endured by my people, the Hebrews, at the hands of Moscow, and to the frightening dangers being prepared for all of us by Moscow. This may pose a question by some of my compatriots. Are they struggling against a real mortal enemy, or maybe, in total ignorance, against shadows of the past? Namely, it was we, the Hebrews, who became the first victims of Bolshevik linguicide. The Hebrew language was banned as reactionary in 1918. All our national awareness was already being mercilessly destroyed in the 1920s. Members of the Zionist movement, even extreme leftist ones, the faithful, rabbis, people of Hebrew cultural orientation disappeared from life. Wide national strata of primarily poor people were treated as minor bourgeoisie and were subjected to brutal dekulakization. When eventually all that was nationally conscious and aware was destroyed, and the people were left without any economic base of their own, the time of our quislings arrived, who helped Moscow organize those repressions in the name of communism. In this way, the treacherous Hebrew section was destroyed because the Moor did his job, and after great purges of the huge party Cheka apparatus, only a few persons of Hebrew origin could be counted. The next step was the destruction of the Yiddish culture and its bearers. Not one Hebrew school, not one Hebrew language book remained in the empire. The death of Stalin saved the remaining Hebrews from organized pogroms and exile in Siberia, but the danger did not disappear. The diplomatic, propagandist, and military endeavors of the USSR for over 20 years have been concentrated on the destruction of Israel and on the fomentation of savage anti-Semitism in the USSR and throughout the entire world. I have with me a collection of Nazi and Soviet anti-Semitic caricatures, which are completely identical, depicting Hebrews as inhuman beings, as global exploiters who feed off wars, who are the enemies of mankind who aspire to seize the entire world, if not already reigning with the help of a universal conspiracy. This is the propagandist background in which in recent years they have wounded Karmi Elbert, a Hebrew child in Kyiv, murdered Makman in Minsk, gouged out the eyes and destroyed the face of prisoner Zion Bernstein, raped and tortured Dan Shapiro, injecting him with drugs, throwing him sacrificially to the dogs, broke the ribs and dislocated the kidneys of Zachary Zinstein and Lazarus Lula. In a Siberian concentration camp, they mercilessly beat Julian Edelstein, a religious Hebrew prisoner convicted of, quote, ritual drug abuse, unquote, a new version of using blood for matzah. Hebrew blood is flowing. Hitler also began with the Hebrews, but he had all of mankind in mind. The Hebrews, Ukrainians, and other nations subjugated by Moscow replied with an incessant spiritual and national rebirth, even under such horrible pressures. Our answer, the answer of all free people who desire to remain free, must be a thorough boycott of Moscow and support for the liberation struggles of the nations occupied by Russia. We must lay aside the terrifying absurd when the new Hitler is being nourished by the bread, technology, and finances of free nations, which he swallows up, one by one. The role of the resistance of the subjugated nations can be seen in the planned invasion of Poland during the Days of Solidarity. The rebirth of the underground Ukrainian Catholic Church and the strengthening of nationalism usurped the mobilization and forced the regime to cancel the invasion. Armed clashes took place between members of the underground and the KGB in the Carpathian Mountains. The renaissance of Islam and the nationalism of the Asian nations of the USSR under the influence of heroic Afghanistan forced Moscow to recall home divisions of its army made up of Muslims. It is difficult to say if Moscow would not have dared to occupy Iran or Pakistan were it not for the state of affairs in Turkestan, where during stormy demonstrations the local youths shouted at the Russians, "Colonialists, get out!" The repressions continue against the occupied Baltic countries, specifically the trial of the Latvian Astra. The last word of this Viking, with whom I spent time in a concentration camp, clearly demonstrates that Moscow has not succeeded in Russifying the spirit of the Baltic people, where, although raised in Soviet times, a Latvian retains the Western mentality and the lucidity of thought of a free human being. The nationalist movement in Armenia and Georgia has become strengthened. Even in distant Yakut, tempestuous demonstrations took place against Russian colonizers. Thousands of Hebrews in the largest centers of Russian chauvinism are secretly learning their outlawed language, culture, and history. They walk about dressed in traditional Hebrew garb, openly returning to their persecuted faith, continuing their sacrificial struggle for their right to return to their reborn Hebrew homeland. Moscow lies, claiming emigration has ended and all those who wanted have already emigrated, while at the same time Hebrew patriots languish in Russian prisons, denied immigration to Israel by the hundreds of thousands. We, a small group of activists in Israel, have documentation on thousands of families who for endless years received denials from the government to their official requests for repatriation to Israel. Anyone who wishes can receive this list document of the lies and cruelty of Moscow, whose word cannot be believed. This sacrificial struggle of the nations subjugated by Moscow has wide humanitarian significance for the free world. Namely, it is this struggle which will determine whether the free world will remain free or fall into the darkness of Muscovite slavery. Liberty is indivisible. If Moscow stifles the resistance of the captive nations, nothing will hold back Russian imperialism from a general offensive on the free world. A victory of the subjugated nations over bloody Moscow will rid the world forever of a fatal threat, of the Russian Damoclean sword which today hangs over all of humanity. Communism incites wars and terror in the world. It is not stopped by anything in its thirst for world domination. It is this communism, propagated by Moscow, which has, without a war, destroyed 130 million people on half of the globe, through artificial famines, concentration camps, and torture, and the remaining slaves, although still alive, should envy the dead. He who claims that it is better to be red than to be dead does not know what he is talking about. I advise him to savor just 1 year of such life in a communist concentration camp, and he will be ready to stand by his liberty and that of his loved ones to the death. No to trade with slave mongers. Yes to aid to the liberation struggle of the nations subjugated by Russia. And then a war with the rapacious Russian Empire will be waged on its domain by its current sacrifices. And then it will not be necessary to choose to be either dead or be red, but it will be possible to remain forever alive and free.
just have we could just have question time until 10:30 when we can have another guest speaker, one of our main guest speakers. So if I give floor to anyone, if anybody wants to ask questions about the things that have been discussed here. Yes, please, you come.
Mr.
Please
Archів.
come, please come so that everybody can hear.
Just a brief question. Mr. Archivudka, is there any way you can contact Simon Wiesenthal and persuade him to concentrate upon the real executionist of your countrymen?
Я можу відповісти таку річ. Я хотів, в першу чергу, щоб у моєму народі не було вбивць. Тобто, якщо є в Ізраїлі хтось з євреїв, хто вбивав людей, скажімо, їх не було в СС чи в Гестапо, коли вони були в ГПУ чи ЧК, чи як ще вони називалися різні часи. Я волів, щоб таких людей серед мого народу не було на волі. Щоб такі люди, якщо вони є, кого б вони не вбивали, це мені не заважає, вони вбивали всіх. Щоб такі люди були судимі, незважаючи якого вони походження і кого вони вбивали. Щоб вони стояли перед судом і сиділи у в'язниці. Так само, як вбивці у нацистській Німеччині, що були на службі нацистської Німеччини, або будь-якого іншого вбивці. Вбивця мусить стояти перед судом, незалежно від його походження і незалежно від того, кому він служив.
I would want that there would not be any murderers or killers amongst my people. If there are any Hebrews who are members of the SS or any other such organizations, they should be brought to trial. Anyone who takes a human life should be brought to trial and demands to be tried by a court of law. I don't mean only my people, the Hebrew people, but every other people of the entire world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Woodcock, for the answer. You may take some more questions, maybe. Yes, yes, please.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to address this to our American delegate. In his assumption, he did clarify a point that he sees Russia will be a second-rate power within the next 20 years. Could he elaborate on that, please?
When we refer to the Soviet Union as a superpower, we do so, of course, strictly in military terms. Economically, the Soviet Union has been referred to as either the poorest country in the first world or the richest country in the third world. Take your pick. Be that as it may, the economic difficulties the Soviet Union will be facing in the years to come are somewhat different from the economic difficulties the Soviet Union has faced since 1917. It's quite fashionable to talk about the economic difficulties of the Soviet Union. Actually, the Soviet Union has had economic difficulties ever since its inception. What differentiates the present situation from the past is the fact that those economic difficulties that the Soviet Union will be facing have certain geopolitical and military implications. The Soviet Union will not be able, as in the past, to match Western military strength by simply producing more and more quantitatively with some improvements qualitatively. The strategic game that will be played in the years to come, particularly with respect to SDI, will be a game where technology will rule supreme. The Soviet Union, being the closed society that it is, simply will not be able to compete with the West in general, the United States in particular, as the 21st century comes into being. I think the Soviet leadership is well aware of this, that they are so vehemently opposed to SDI reflects a fear that, in my opinion, is well-founded. Trying to keep the economic keel, trying to keep the Soviet economies on an economic keel while at the same time competing in a military fashion with the United States, where from one can assume from the very beginning that the Soviet Union will simply not be able to keep pace. As a matter of fact, they're falling farther and farther behind, and we can assume over the years and decades to come that the technological gap between the West and the Soviet Union will widen and not narrow. This is not going to be something, as I pointed out, that happens overnight. The implications of this will probably not make themselves be felt for another 15 or 20 years. I think you might begin to see the initial installment of some relatively primitive SDI system by the end of this decade. It will be throughout the decade of the 1990s and the first years of the 21st century that the protective shield will be put into place on a step-by-step basis, not only over the United States, but with the consent of the allies of the United States, also over Western Europe, Japan, and whichever countries desire the protective shield. As I said, this will radically change the, if I may use the Soviet term, the correlation of forces in the world, because the bullying and intimidation that the Soviet Union can do with its nuclear power will simply no longer be possible. They will have a tremendous conventional force with which we will have to deal, but they will not have the nuclear intimidation factor behind that force that they do have now. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you.
In Poznan, 28th of June 1956, there were 51 killed. And the importance of that event is that led to the Polish October in 1956, with Gomulka opposing Khrushchev. But what people always forget, and I was twice silenced by one or two of our exiles, the events in 1956 started in Georgia after the destabilization speech by Khrushchev. They were timed for the 9th of March 1956 because Monsieur Pinault, the French Prime Minister, was coming to Tbilisi. And the event started in the 5th of March and lasted then until the 11th. The tanks manned by Kyrgyz and Mongol troops wiped out about 1,000 Georgian students. And there were about between 3,000 and 10,000 deported. We don't know exactly, some people say more. But the fact was that what started first as for the defense of Stalin's good name really was a nationalist uprising. And that was why it was suppressed. And I think simply, if you compare the losses of...
Following on from a point about SDI and technology, there is of course one problem, and I hope that Dr. Morgan will also address this point. That is that there are some Western businessmen who will do anything for money and therefore are targets to be bribed by the Soviets to give away technological secrets. Now, my question is, I want to know what the United States are going to do and what steps they are going to take to ensure that the Soviets do not get their hands on any of that SDI technology.
That's an excellent question, and the gentleman actually spoke to 2 points. First has to do with the trade kind of behavior on the part of the many Western firms, what we call irresponsible capitalism, still rules today. I might add that the foundation for which I work in Washington is presently engaged in a campaign to force university and college endowments to divest themselves of businesses, of companies that do business with the Soviet Union. We currently have approximately 100 campaigns across American universities, and we're going to be expanding into Canada early next year. We want to reshape and redefine the foreign policy debate taking place in the world today by forcing the university administrators and university professors, from whom we know they tend very much to fly to the left of center, to face the human rights violations openly that take place in the Soviet Union. And we furthermore want to force American firms and other firms to face up to the fact that by doing business with the Soviet Union, they are not only earning a few dollars, but they are participating in the oppression of millions and millions of men, women, and children across the face of the earth. As regards the second part of your question, the possibility that the Soviets will get their hands on SDI technology, of course you're quite correct, they would love it. We can expect that the Soviet businessmen, quote-unquote, trade representatives, quote-unquote, journalists, quote-unquote, and the other people who can be found at the Soviet embassies, consulates, United Nations delegations, and such as that will go at lengths to get their hands on SDI technology. It is to be hoped that the United States will, working together with its allies, go to great lengths to make sure that this kind of technology transfer does not take place.
Good morning, Mr. the President and the Chairman of the panel, friends. This is a great honor for me to have a colleague sit side by side with me. This question will pose to the Israel delegate. Maybe he doesn't hear my question. Mr. Delegate from Israel, this question will pose directly to you, sir. The thing is, since the war is over, from Israel, you get your country back. You know how suffer of the people losing the country. I'm sorry, many, many years since I left my country, I do not hear anything from Israel government or civilian support for our cause. For example, the resistance movement, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Vietnam, Cambodia, and so on. So, have you heard anything from your organization, your government, or your friend, give us any support, direct support or indirect support for us to get back the country as you are the last century? Thank you very much.
Ізраїль не є відмінною країною в цьому відношенні від інших країн Заходу. І поки великі держави Заходу, такі як Сполучені Штати Америки, Англія, Франція, Західня Німеччина, не надають ніякої суттєвої допомоги визвольним змаганням поневолених народів, важко чекати від дуже-дуже маленької країни, що вона це зробить перша. Є ще інша проблема, що сьогодні прем'єр-міністр Ізраїля є соціаліст, то навряд чи може чекати, що він буде більшим патріотом визвольних антикомуністичних змагань, ніж, скажімо, президент Рейган, що він антисоціаліст.
The situation with Israel is similar to other countries of the West. They are big countries like United States, England, France, Western Germany, which do not support any resistance movements. And there is another problem with Israel. In Israel, there is a socialist government, and it is it is not possible to wait for greater support of the socialist government for the struggle against communism than from the governments which are not socialist, like the United States with President Reagan.
Я є гарячим прихильником того, щоб моя країна допомагала визвольним рухам у світі антикомуністичним. І наскільки це залежить від мене, я роблю все для цього, щоб так було. Щоб в першу чергу зрозуміли ті визвольні рухи, їхні цілі, і що це пов'язано із нашою безпекою. По-друге, щоб робили певні заходи, щоб допомогти цим рухам. Наприклад, трофейну совєтську зброю, щоб надавали цим рухам. І я не певний, що це не робиться якоюсь мірою, бо не все відомо, не все є відкрито.
If it depends on me, of course, I'm doing my best that these movements should be supported. And of course, it should be somehow balanced with security, because it will be for the risk of security for my own country. And of course, I'm explaining the aims, and security is the aims to be combined. And I am for that the government, our government and other governments should not give the sophisticated weaponry to the communist governments to crash the movements.
У всіх війнах Ізраїля було закладено дуже багато трофейної совєтської зброї. Я вважаю, що це найкраща річ для допомоги повстанцям в антикомуністичних рухах. Я маю на увазі в першу чергу таку зброю, як «Катюші», які стріляють на 40 кілометрів або більше навіть. І дуже легкі для таємного постачання і для пересування в умовах партизанської війни. Маю на увазі такі ракети, як «Стріла» совєтські, що спрямовані проти літаків і гелікоптери. І ця зброя була б дуже добра для афганців в першу чергу і для інших теж. Справа в тому, що це мусить бути ініціатива, я вважаю, в першу чергу американська, щоб цю зброю якось передати. Є дуже багато трофейної зброї такої. Передати афганським повстанцям і іншим повстанцям антикомуністичним.
In all wars against Israel, the Soviet weaponry was used. And I am for that such kind of weaponry like rockets or which can be employed in helicopters, Katyushi, they are very good to be if they are supplied to the insurgent movements. But of course, I am of the opinion that the initiative should be taken by the United States.
Thank you for your answer. Thank you, Mr. Stetro, for the explanation. I hope we will gain back the country with your promise. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Woodka, on behalf of all the audience, for your very clarifying answers to the very interesting questions. May I call now one of our guest speakers, Mr. Morgan, Dr. Jimmy Morgan. Dr. Jimmy Morgan is the Texas State Chairman of the Conservative Caucus. He's also the State Executive Committee man for the Republican Party, and he has worked with President Reagan on a White House fellowship for 1 year. He is an author, publisher, and the editor of the Political Journal. He's also chairman of the Texas Grassroots Coalition. He is a precinct chairman, county commissioner, and an election judge. Mr. Morgan has been fighting communism since 1965 in Vietnam. He has served on the staff of the United States Congress, worked for the CAI for the 3 years, and he is the author of the book, The Strategy of Communism Today. Dr. Morgan is a lecturer and hosts the radio talk show Issues with Issues, where Dr. Morgan stated, as long as my sons and daughters live, as long as my finance can survive after my death, I will fight communism and its evil ends of world domination and slavery. Dr. Morgan, please.
I want to take a moment to say that after I get through speaking, we'll have a coffee break. You'll probably need it. I want to partially speak to one of the questions that was asked of Ari Vudka about Israel's assistance in some of the freedom campaigns around the world. In recent trips to Nicaragua, to the jungles of Nicaragua and Honduras, I have seen Israeli support there. Not all the time that the Israelis are very public in what they do, but I can assure you they are involved in counter-communist aggression in many places of the world, for I have seen them there personally in the jungles of Nicaragua, supplying certain arms and support to the Contras or freedom fighters of Nicaragua. Just to add a little support for the Israeli question, they are involved. Ladies and gentlemen, and most honored Presidium, the Honorable Yaroslav Stetsko, and to a very special lady, Ms. Slava Stetsko, I want to bring greetings and an assurance today to you, the free men and those that are still fighting for their freedom today, from those in the United States that are still steadfast and that love freedom as you, and frankly are willing to fight and die if necessary to deter the forces of communist tyranny and the barbaric aggression in the Americas, the Baltic states, and around the world. I'd like today to bring to you an urgent, I believe, review of American foreign policy. I don't believe in speaking merely for the purpose of standing before you, which is a great honor, and speaking. But I believe that when we speak, we should say something that should have definite goals and definite plans, and that we should have results from when we get through. I may say some things today that might seem radical. I may say some things today that may offend someone. It's not my intention to sound radical or my intention to offend anyone. But we're talking about a very somber and serious situation in the world today. We're talking about the very survival of the free world. If you listen to Mr. Vudka's speech, you could see the human rights violations, the torture, the barbarianism, the inhumanity of the Soviets to the oppressed people of the world. It's a very somber situation, a very serious situation, as you all know. And it's one that does not require impotency, but potency. I believe that American policy is one right now that must be changed before it's too late. And I assure you that we, the conservative movement of the United States, has a full-scale attack against our present Secretary of State, Mr. Schultz. The man needs to be terminated from his employment as Secretary of State of the United States. Events in the past few months have forced many Americans to reassess our posture in the world, and certainly out of necessity to re-examine some of the policy decisions of the past 2 decades, which frankly has made our current situation of impotency a basic demonstration of the dangers that are inherent in the decline in America's power. Probably no word in the English language is more misunderstood than the word power. And for the past 2 decades, there's been a very conscious effort made by the liberal media and the liberal academia and the resident communists to convince Americans that somehow it's dangerous and immoral for the United States to be powerful. And let me say at the outset today that in no way do I feel threatened that the United States is the most powerful nation in the world. Quite the opposite, I feel threatened when we are not. And certainly, and unfortunately, we're very close to that point, if not already there, right now. Presently, I will discuss Secretary Shultz and some of the hard facts about what he's doing in American foreign policy and the serious consequences if we Americans for one moment believe that the Soviets have integrity, or that they have honor, or that they have good intentions, or that they have even one iota of humanity. Secretary of Defense Weinberger was quite to the point when he warned President Reagan before the summit not to sell the United States and the free world out by giving away the high frontier. I have always been an advocate of military superiority, and I always will be. I will always be an advocate of the use of American might for noble ends in a world which may either welcome or hate our environment. And certainly, in some cases, it will be welcome, and in some cases, it will be hated. But while might does not necessarily make right, it is very obvious to me in the context of our current world situation that right will never triumph without might. We must continue to remain strong. We must continue to build our offense as well as our strategic defense initiative. We must very well stay strong. In America, we have a saying that sometimes the best defense is a good offense. And I believe that today, even from this meeting, even from the ABN and the EFC, we can say the best defense is a good offense, and I hope to discuss with you today some small portion of strategy that I would recommend. The question facing the United States, and indeed the free world, is whether the U.S. remains the most powerful nation in the world and endeavors to utilize that power for peaceful ends, or whether we will allow lesser powers to assume the position of world leadership and use their power for less noble, or in the case of the communists, obviously evil ends. Some years ago, I picked up a newspaper after the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan, and the banner headline read, "President Carter has told the Russians to get out of Afghanistan." You can imagine what the Russians were saying in private to Jimmy Carter. We have a term in Texas that we say, "shove it." There was a time when a president of the United States could have said, "get out of Afghanistan," and they would have gotten out of Afghanistan. But no longer. We're no longer in that position of power, where the Soviets are afraid of anything that the Americans say. As I said, there may be some that may not like to hear what I say today, and I respect your opinion. And I'm an American, and I'm being a little critical of us today, but certainly we have had need for some 30 years of criticism. Only a truly powerful nation can issue ultimatums such as that Jimmy Carter issued. And we have long since passed from a position to be able to do that. I heard a lot of addresses from the floor even, and from many of our guest speakers addressing the dangers of Eurocommunism. Don't think for a moment that the communism that we see in the Soviet Union is all that we have to fear. There are communisms that are attacking Europe. They come in different clothing, but they're no less a danger. When communism started moving into Italy and in France and in the other Western countries, the apologists told us that they were different kinds of communism, that they weren't really a threat, that they would work within the system. And therefore we don't have to worry about them. I say nonsense. Communists historically work within the system until they can kill off enough people to control the state. Yet we fall for this line time after time. Only the names change. Stalin, Lenin, Khrushchev, Gromyko, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, and now Gorbachev. The plan is the same. To conquer the world, to enslave the world, world dominion. The one objective. No matter what the name, no matter how the face smiles, no matter how smooth the presentation is before the world media, the plan is the same and we can never forget it. We are at war, and we can only present our efforts as if we were at war with them. No one has ever accused the Soviets of being stupid. The handwriting has been on the wall for the past 7 years, and they are now exploiting their opportunities. Their direct invasion in Afghanistan was based on their appraisal of the temper of leadership in the U.S. They saw Jimmy Carter, and in him they saw weakness. He spoke from his mouth, weakness from his heart. We are many times what we say. But more importantly than the temper of our leadership, they looked at their own strength. And they evaluated it and saw from it a temper and a direction. And the simple, basic, and dangerous point is that they have achieved the military capacity that they can now proceed, regardless of what response they might get from the U.S. or the free world. Now, this doesn't mean they would necessarily risk an all-out war at the present time, but it does mean that they have the dimension of their own military force to calculate present and future moves, and they will, based on their strength and our weakness. One of the greatest tragedies of the Russian invasion in Afghanistan is the shock that it brought to many Americans who should have known better. We were caught again asleep. We've been brainwashed by the media and by our politicians to believe that the Russians have changed. Like the leopard, they have changed their spots. It will never happen. And I ask you, what would any rational person believe? The communist tyrants have changed. What have they done in the past 35 years to show that they have relented one iota in their announced drive for world dominion? I'm an O-line anti-communist, and I'm proud of it. I've never changed, and I never will, in my resolve to warn the Americans and the free world of our communist enemies. And they, frankly, will never change either. We understand each other very well. There are those in the United States, some of our resident communists and liberals, that have found it very fashionable to smugly say that it isn't so, that the communists have changed. They are concerned about world opinion. It isn't so, and they're dead wrong. And I say today, if you believe that, then find you a Montagnard tribesman and ask him about the communists, if you can find one still in existence. Ask the Mosquito Indians of Nicaragua. Ask Mr. Maillard. Ask Ari Wood. Ask those in Soviet prison camps. Ask those from the countries of Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Belarusia, Poland, Hungary, Czechia, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, Turkestan, Georgia, Armenia, Vietnam, Nicaragua, Cuba, Laos, Cambodia, Afghanistan, and all the other subjugated nations Ask them if the Soviets have changed. Ask them what the goals are of the Soviets. The barbarian Soviet tyrants' invasion of Afghanistan is according to their script. When their interest dictates, they move. They use propaganda to influence world opinion with things like they moved in just to help their friendly neighbor, to support them and help them fight the imperialists that they were asked into Afghanistan. They set up their puppet leaders just like they did in Eastern Europe, and they execute by the tens of thousands their opponents just as they did in Warsaw and the Katyn Forest and in their other satellite countries. That we know from experience. They act just like they've always acted, as tyrants, as barbarians, as murderers. And what do we do about it? Not just as Americans, but what do we do as free people around the world? The United States' superiority over the Soviets is so dangerously declined to such a margin as to give the United States a doubtful outcome if our capabilities were challenged. In no area can we more clearly trace the decline of our superiority than in our basic declaratory policy. And I'd like for just a moment and very briefly to kind of go back and look at this dastardly funereal procession of American policy. Under Truman and Eisenhower, our avowed policy was massive retaliation against an enemy, whether we were confronted with local or regional aggression of any type. We were superior in every area. We hardly needed an early warning system even. Our lead was so overwhelming that only a lunatic would have challenged us. And then we moved to another area called a sure destruction policy. And here, we started to change in the early 60s under Secretary McNamara. For the first time, our leaders talked in terms of possible damage to our own populations. And under the Kennedy administration, we began to phase out our bombers. And at this point, our superiority began to deteriorate. And then we moved to a policy that Mr. Yaroslav Stesko continues to talk about, and that's our first attempt at mutually assured destruction. This policy was announced by Secretary McNamara in 1967, and for the first time, the word mutual was injected into what had up to that time been one-sided. Then we moved to President Nixon in an area in which I ceased to be a Nixon supporter, when he moved into an area of strategic sufficiency. Suddenly we had passed to sufficiency instead of superiority, while Russia was catching up quickly. And then we moved into an area in 1974 of essential equivalence, an area of foreign policy of where we were literally whistling in the dark. No one really knew what our foreign policy was. And the USSR, in the meantime, had started a massive civil defense program, spending billions of dollars and circumventing the very avowed purpose of the ABM Treaty. And the Americans slept on. Then we moved to the era of rough equivalence under Secretary Rumsfeld in '76, which the announced policy